2,300 years ago, two rival philosophies appeared in Athens within a single generation. They agreed on almost nothing except the question that produced them. That question was blunt. How do you live well when the world offers you no guarantees? One school said, withdraw, simplify, and eliminate every unnecessary desire from your life. The other said, engage, accept, and recognize that nothing external can touch your real self. The first was Epicureanism. The second was Stoicism. Both are still alive inside decisions you make every week without naming them. Every time you weigh whether to protect your peace or meet an obligation, you replay this conflict. Every time you ask whether an emotion is telling you something real or distorting your judgment, you choose sides. This is not ancient history. It is the architecture of a problem you already inhabit. What follows is not a survey of two schools placed side by side for easy comparison. It is a reconstruction of why each system exists, built from the ground up. We begin with the crisis that forced both into existence. Then we trace each one from its foundations through its physics, psychology, and ethics. Only after each system is fully assembled do we stage the confrontation between them. The goal is not to pick a winner. The goal is to understand exactly what each commitment demands and what it costs. Part 1. The world that fell apart. For roughly 2 centuries, the Greek city-state had answered the question of how to live. The answer was built into the structure of daily existence. You were an Athenian, a Spartan, a Corinthian. Your identity was fused to a specific political community with its own laws, customs, and gods. The question of purpose did not arise as a private dilemma because the city answered it for you. You deliberated in the assembly, you fought in the army, you worshipped at the civic temples. Your life had meaning because it was embedded in a public order larger than any individual. This arrangement was never as stable as it sounds, but it held long enough to shape philosophy. Plato wrote about justice as the proper ordering of the soul and the city together. Aristotle treated ethics and politics as parts of a single inquiry. When he defined human flourishing, he assumed a person living in a functioning community. A community that provided education, friendships, moderate wealth, and political participation. These were not luxuries in Aristotle's framework. They were conditions without which a good life could not reliably occur. Then Alexander of Macedon conquered everything from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India. He died in 323 before the Common Era, at 32, without a clear successor. His generals carved the empire into warring kingdoms. The independent city-state, already weakened by decades of war among Greek powers, effectively ceased to exist. Athens still stood, but it no longer governed itself in any meaningful sense. Citizens became subjects of distant monarchs who could rewrite laws and reassign territories at will. The public framework that had organized meaning for generations was gone. Think about what this actually means for a person living through it. A merchant in Athens around 300 before the Common Era wakes up in a city that looks familiar. The same buildings stand, the same markets operate, the same hills surround him. But the assembly that once decided war and peace now answers to a Macedonian garrison commander. The legal protections his grandfather relied on can be overridden by a foreign king's decree. His wealth can be confiscated if the political winds shift. His children might be expelled from the city if a new ruler decides to resettle the population. The old answer to how to live well, which depended on stable civic institutions, no longer works. Not because it was wrong in principle, but because the institutions it required have been destroyed. This is the vacuum into which both Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged. They are not abstract thought experiments produced by scholars with time on their hands. They are emergency philosophies designed for people whose external world has become unreliable. The question they share is urgent and concrete. If everything outside you can be taken away, where do you locate a life worth living? Their answers to that question could not be more different. But the question itself is identical, and understanding it is the only way to understand why the answers diverge. Part 2. What came before the inherited toolkit? Before we reach either Epicurus or the Stoics, we need to see what they were reacting against. The dominant account of a good life in Greek philosophy came from Aristotle. His position sounds reasonable, and that is precisely the problem. Aristotle held that human flourishing requires the exercise of virtue over a complete life. Virtue meant something broader than moral goodness in the modern sense. It meant excellence of character, courage, justice, temperance, practical wisdom. A person who exercises these qualities consistently and well is living as a human being should. But Aristotle added a crucial qualification. Virtue alone is not enough for flourishing. You also need what he called external goods. External goods include health, adequate wealth, good friends, a decent reputation, even physical appearance. Aristotle was not being shallow. His reasoning was that a person of extraordinary virtue, who is also desperately poor, sick, friendless and exiled, cannot plausibly be called flourishing. A life of constant deprivation, no matter how virtuous, is incomplete. Flourishing requires both inner excellence and outer conditions that allow that excellence to operate. You need resources to be generous, you need a community to practice justice, you need health to act at all. Inside a stable city-state, this view is not only reasonable but nearly self-evident. The city provides the conditions: courts where justice is practiced, assemblies where wisdom is exercised, markets where generosity has scope. Your virtues find their natural expression in a functioning public world. External goods are broadly available to citizens of moderate standing. The framework works because the city works. Now remove the city. The institutions that supplied external goods are gone or unreliable. Health depends on fortune, wealth on the whims of a monarch. Friendships are disrupted by war and exile. Under these conditions, Aristotle's framework delivers a devastating verdict. If flourishing requires external goods, and external goods depend on stable institutions, and stable institutions no longer exist, then flourishing is a matter of luck. You can be the most virtuous person alive and still fail to live well through no fault of your own. For someone standing in Athens in 300 before the Common Era, watching the third change of regime in a decade, this is not a theoretical concern. It is a description of daily life. Both Epicurus and the Stoics identified this as the critical failure in the inherited tradition. A philosophy that makes your well-being dependent on conditions you cannot control is not a cure for human vulnerability. It is a diagnosis of it. The project of both schools was to construct a framework in which a good life does not depend on fortune. But they pursued this project in opposite directions. Epicurus asked what you can subtract from your life until what remains is unshakable. The Stoics asked what you can redefine about value until nothing external qualifies as genuinely good. One path leads to the garden, the other to the porch. Both begin here, standing in the ruins of Aristotle's framework, looking for something that holds. Part 3. Epicurus enters the garden. Epicurus was born in 341, before the Common Era, on the island of Samos, a Greek colony. He grew up during exactly the period of chaos just described. After Alexander's death, Athenian settlers were expelled from Samos by one of the successor generals. Epicurus, still a teenager, was uprooted from his home and sent to join his family in a coastal town in Asia Minor. He studied under a follower of Democritus, the early atomist philosopher, and absorbed a thoroughgoing materialism. By his early 30s, he had moved to Athens and purchased a property just outside the city walls. This property had a garden, and the garden became the school. That location was itself a philosophical declaration. Plato had taught in the Academy, a semi-public gymnasium associated with civic life. Aristotle had taught in the Lyceum, another civic space. Epicurus chose a private garden, removed from the public sphere. The message was structural before it was verbal. Philosophy happens when you step back from the city. The inscription reportedly placed at the garden's entrance read that the highest good within was pleasure. Visitors expecting luxury found simple meals, water to drink, and long conversations among friends. The garden admitted women and enslaved people, which was radical by Athenian standards. This was not incidental to the philosophy. If the good life does not depend on citizenship, status, or public role, then these social categories are irrelevant to who can pursue it. The garden enacted the philosophy before Epicurus finished articulating it. Epicurus made a foundational commitment that shaped everything else in the system. Philosophy is medicine for the soul. Any philosophy that does not directly reduce human suffering is empty words. The point is not to understand the universe for its own sake, but to eliminate the fears and false beliefs that produce misery. This is called the therapeutic model of philosophy. It means every claim Epicurus makes about atoms, about the gods, about death, serves a single purpose. If it does not help a person suffer less, it does not belong in the system. This commitment determines the order of everything that follows. We start with the goal. What does a life free of suffering actually look like? Then we examine what stands in the way: false beliefs about pleasure, desire, the gods, and death. Then we look at the physics that dissolves those false beliefs. Every piece interlocks with every other piece, but the entry point is always the same. You are in pain, and this system exists to end that pain. That framing sounds modest until you see how far it forces Epicurus to go. Part 4. Pleasure is not what you think it is. Here is the common-sense version of Epicureanism that most people carry around. Epicurus said pleasure is the highest good, so he must have meant that you should pursue enjoyment. Eat well, drink well, seek out sensory experience, maximize gratification. The word Epicurean in modern English means exactly this: a lover of fine food and luxury. This understanding is not only wrong, but almost perfectly inverted from what Epicurus actually argued. The argument begins with a distinction most people have never considered. There are two fundamentally different kinds of pleasure. The first is what Epicurus called kinetic pleasure, the active sensation of enjoyment while satisfying a desire. The taste of food when you're hungry, the warmth of a fire when you're cold. Kinetic pleasure is real, but it has a specific structure. It exists only in the transition from a state of need to a state of satisfaction. Once the need is gone, the pleasure associated with meeting it disappears too. The second kind is what Epicurus called katastematic pleasure, the stable state of having no unmet need, not the thrill of eating, but the calm of being fully nourished. Not the rush of warming yourself, but the settled comfort of being warm. This is the state where nothing is lacking, nothing hurts, and no desire is pulling at you. Epicurus argued that this second kind of pleasure is the real target. The reasoning is precise. Kinetic pleasure depends on a preceding state of deprivation. You have to be hungry before eating gives you pleasure. You have to be cold before warmth feels good. That means chasing kinetic pleasure requires you to cycle endlessly between pain and relief. You must keep generating new desires so that satisfying them produces new bursts of enjoyment. This is a treadmill, and Epicurus saw that it could never reach a stable destination. Katastematic pleasure, by contrast, is a state you can remain in. When every natural need is met and no unnecessary desire is disturbing you, you have arrived. There is nowhere further to go because there is nothing missing. Epicurus gave this state a specific name, ataraxia, meaning freedom from mental disturbance. Paired with aponia, the absence of physical pain, this constitutes the highest achievable condition. Consider a concrete case. A woman finishes a long day of physical work, eats a simple meal of bread and cheese, sits with a close friend in quiet conversation as the evening cools. Nothing remarkable is happening. No extraordinary sensation is present. But nothing is wrong either. No anxiety about the future, no craving for something she lacks, no pain in her body. For Epicurus, this woman is at the ceiling of human happiness. Adding a lavish feast would not increase her pleasure because her hunger is already gone. Adding fame would not help because she has no need for public recognition. She is already where the most ambitious hedonist is trying to get, and she arrived by wanting less. This is why the common-sense image of Epicureanism collapses on contact with the actual argument. Epicurus did not say, pursue pleasure. He said the highest pleasure is the absence of pain, and the fastest route there is the elimination of unnecessary desire. The result is a life of almost austere simplicity, plain food, a small circle of friends, no political ambition. But that leaves a hard question. How do you know which desires are unnecessary? Epicurus had a precise answer, and it structures the entire practical side of his philosophy. Part 5. The Epicurean Calculus of Desire. Epicurus divided all human desires into 3 categories. The classification is not arbitrary. It follows directly from the goal of ataraxia, and getting it wrong is, in his view, the primary source of human misery. The first category is desires that are both natural and necessary. These include the desire for food sufficient to end hunger, water sufficient to end thirst, shelter from extreme weather, and basic physical safety. These desires have a built-in limit. Once you have eaten enough, the desire for food subsides. They track genuine biological needs, and satisfying them returns you to a state of equilibrium. You cannot have too much satisfaction of a truly necessary desire, because the desire itself tells you when to stop. The second category is desires that are natural but not necessary. The desire for particularly tasty food when plain food would suffice. The desire for sexual pleasure beyond basic physical release. The desire for varied or rich experience when simple experience would meet your needs. These desires are rooted in nature, meaning they arise from genuine features of your biology, but they lack the clear limit of the first category. You can always want food that is a little tastier, experience that is a little richer. These desires are not dangerous on their own, but they become dangerous when you mistake them for necessities. The third category is desires that are neither natural nor necessary. The desire for fame, for political power, for extreme wealth, for status relative to other people. These are entirely generated by false beliefs about what you need. Nothing in your biology demands that strangers admire you or that you possess more than your neighbour. These desires have no natural stopping point whatsoever. There is no amount of fame that fully satisfies the desire for fame. There is no level of wealth that permanently quiets the desire for more wealth. They are structurally insatiable, and pursuing them guarantees perpetual dissatisfaction. Now, watch how this classification operates inside a life you recognize. A young professional in any modern city wakes up, checks her phone, and sees a colleague's promotion announcement on social media. A knot forms in her stomach. She has a good job, sufficient income, close friends, a comfortable apartment. By Epicurus's first category, every necessary desire is met. By the second category, most of her natural desires are satisfied. But the knot in her stomach comes entirely from the third category. She is comparing her status to someone else's, and the comparison has generated a desire that did not exist 5 minutes ago. No change in her actual circumstances produced this unhappiness. A false belief about what she needs produced it. the belief that her standing relative to others is something that matters for her well-being. Epicurus would say this woman's suffering is entirely self-inflicted, not through weakness of character, but through a misclassification of desire. She has filed a third category desire under the first category. She is treating status anxiety as though it were hunger. The cure is not to satisfy the desire, because it cannot be satisfied. The cure is to recognize it as a false need and withdraw your investment in it. This is cognitive work, not willpower. It requires understanding the structure of your own desires well enough to sort them correctly. The modern advertising industry operates almost entirely in Epicurus's third category. Its function is to take desires that are neither natural nor necessary and make them feel urgent, essential, and biological. The feeling that you need a specific brand of shoes, a newer car, a higher title, is manufactured disturbance. Epicurus did not know about advertising, but he identified the mechanism with precision. The question his classification leaves open is whether you can actually perform this sorting in practice. Knowing that a desire is unnecessary does not automatically make it stop pulling at you. He had a set of core principles designed to assist with exactly this difficulty. Part 6. The Four-Part Cure. Epicurus and his followers condensed the core therapeutic insights of the philosophy into 4 compressed principles. Later, Epicureans called this the tetrapharmakos, a term borrowed from a medical remedy made of 4 ingredients. The metaphor was deliberate. These are drugs for the mind, to be taken when anxiety strikes. The 4 principles are: the gods are not to be feared, death is nothing to us, what is good is easy to get, what is terrible is easy to endure. Each one is an argument, not a slogan, and each one targets a specific source of human suffering. The first principle: the gods are not to be feared. Epicurus did not deny that gods exist. He argued that the gods, as perfectly self-sufficient beings, have no reason to involve themselves in human affairs. A being that is complete and undisturbed would not monitor your behavior, deliver punishments, or answer prayers. The entire apparatus of divine anger and cosmic judgment is a human invention driven by fear. A priest in a temple in Athens telling worshippers that the gods will punish their transgressions is, on this view, a propagator of needless anxiety. Remove the false belief in divine surveillance, and an enormous source of mental suffering vanishes. The second principle: death is nothing to us. This is the most famous and most debated element of Epicurean philosophy. The argument runs as follows: all experience requires a subject who is experiencing. Death is the permanent end of the experiencing subject because the soul, being made of atoms, disperses at death. Where death is, you are not. Where you are, death is not. Therefore, you and death can never meet. Fearing death is fearing a state you will never be in, which is logically equivalent to fearing nothing at all. There is a further move that strengthens the argument. Consider the infinite stretch of time before you were born. You experienced none of it, and it caused you no distress. The infinite stretch of time after your death is structurally identical. If the first bothers you not at all, the second should not either. This is sometimes called the symmetry argument, and it has a deceptive simplicity. Whether it actually works is a genuinely open question. A critic might respond that the reason we fear death is not the state of being dead, but the loss of future goods. A 40-year-old diagnosed with a terminal illness does not fear the blankness after death. She grieves the years she will not have, the experiences that will never occur. Epicurus could respond that those future goods do not yet exist, and you cannot be deprived of something that does not exist. But this response has a coldness to it that many have found unpersuasive. The debate has continued in philosophy of death for over 2 millennia and has not been resolved. The Epicurean argument is more rigorous than most people realize, and it may still be wrong. The third principle, what is good, is easy to get. This follows directly from the desire classification. If the only real goods are the satisfaction of natural and necessary desires, then the good life requires bread, water, shelter, and friendship. None of these is rare or expensive. The belief that the good life requires wealth, fame, or extraordinary experience is a third category error. Strip it away, and you find that what you actually need is available almost everywhere. The fourth principle, what is terrible is easy to endure. This is the most contested of the four. Epicurus argued that intense pain is usually brief, and prolonged pain is usually mild. A kidney stone produces agony, but passes within days. A chronic ache persists, but rarely overwhelms. The cases that violate this pattern, severe and prolonged suffering, are genuinely terrible. Epicurus reportedly accepted that in the most extreme cases, a person may rationally choose to end their own life. This was not flippant, but consistent with the system. If the pain exceeds all available pleasure permanently, the calculus points to exit. Epicurus himself died of kidney stones after 2 weeks of severe pain. According to accounts preserved by later writers, he spent his final day in a warm bath, conversing with friends, and said he was happy. His claim was that the memory of good conversations and friendships outweighed the physical agony. Whether you find this inspiring or implausible says something about where you stand on his philosophy. But the system holds together on its own terms. If mental pleasure and mental pain are the deeper registers, and if philosophical understanding gives you mastery over the mental register, then physical suffering can in principle be endured. The principle does not claim suffering is trivial. It claims that the mind, properly trained, is the decisive battlefield. What the Tetrapharmakos leaves unexplained is why the universe has the features that make these claims true. Why does the soul disperse at death? Why are the gods uninvolved? Why is there no cosmic punishment? Epicurus did not ask you to take these claims on faith. He built an entire physics to demonstrate them. Part 7. Atoms, Void and Liberation. Most presentations of Epicurean physics treat it as background, a historical curiosity separate from the ethics. Epicurus himself would have rejected that separation completely. The physics is not optional context. It is the engine that drives the entire therapeutic program. Every fear the Tetrapharmakos targets is a fear rooted in a false picture of how the universe works. Replace the false picture with the true one, and the fears dissolve at their source. Epicurus inherited his physics from Democritus, an earlier Greek thinker born around 460 before the Common Era. Democritus had proposed that everything in the universe is composed of two things, atoms and void. Atoms are tiny, indivisible, indestructible particles of matter. Void is empty space through which atoms move. Everything you see, touch, taste and feel is a temporary arrangement of atoms in void. When those atoms disperse, the arrangement ends. When they come together in new configurations, new things arise. Epicurus adopted this framework almost entirely, but made several crucial modifications. Atoms differ from one another only in shape, size, and weight. There is a large but finite number of shapes, an infinite number of atoms, and an infinite amount of void. The universe has no edge and no centre. There is no architect, no governing intelligence, no cosmic plan. Atoms move through void by their own weight, collide, combine, separate, and recombine endlessly. The world you live in, including your own body and mind, is one temporary arrangement among infinite others. Now trace the ethical consequences. If the soul is made of atoms, then when the body dies, the soul's atoms scatter. There is no immaterial substance that survives, no ghost that floats to judgment, no afterlife of any kind. The second principle of the Tetrapharmakos, that death is nothing to us, is not a psychological trick. It is a direct consequence of atomic physics. If you are your atoms and your atoms disperse, then you cease to exist. There is no you to experience punishment or reward after death. If the universe has no governing intelligence, then no one is watching. The gods, if they exist, are themselves made of atoms, dwelling in the spaces between worlds. They do not intervene because they have no reason to. Lightning is not Zeus punishing a city. Earthquakes are not Poseidon expressing anger. These are atomic processes with atomic causes, nothing more. The first principle of the Tetrapharmakos, that gods are not to be feared, follows directly from the physics. Consider what this means for someone living in a world saturated with religious fear. A farmer in the 3rd century before the Common Era watches a drought destroy his crops and assumes a god is displeased. He spends money on sacrifices, consults oracles, lies awake, fearing further punishment. Epicurean physics tells him that the drought is atoms and void, causes and effects, nothing personal. No god is angry, no punishment is being delivered, no sacrifice will change the weather. The fear dissolves, not through willpower or denial, but through a better understanding of how things work. This is why Epicurus insisted that studying nature was essential to happiness. You cannot stop fearing what you do not understand. The physics also grounds the 3rd and 4th principles. If the universe is atoms in void, then the goods necessary for life are material and simple: food, water, shelter, warmth. These are abundantly available in nature. The belief that you need something beyond them, cosmic approval, immortal fame, divine favour, is false, because the universe does not traffic in such things. What is good is easy to get, because the universe is made of nothing but matter, and matter can satisfy material needs. But this liberating picture contains a devastating problem. If atoms move according to fixed physical laws, then every collision is determined by the collision before it. Your thoughts are atomic events. Your choices are atomic events, and every atomic event is the necessary result of prior causes stretching back to infinity. Under strict atomism, the future is already written in the positions and velocities of every atom in the universe. Free will is an illusion, and if free will is an illusion, then the entire Epicurean program collapses. You cannot choose to classify your desires correctly if you have no real capacity to choose. Epicurus saw this problem and proposed the most controversial element of his entire system to solve it. Part 8. The Swerve, Epicurus's Gamble on Free Will. In strict Democritean atomism, all atoms fall downward through the void at equal speed in parallel lines. Their paths are determined entirely by their weight and shape and their prior collisions. Given a complete description of the state of every atom at any moment, the future is fixed. This is determinism at the most fundamental level of physical reality. Epicurus introduced a modification that his critics have attacked for over 2,000 years. At unpredictable times and places, an atom deviates slightly from its path. The deviation is tiny, the smallest possible change in direction. It is not caused by anything external to the atom. It simply happens without a preceding cause, at no fixed time, and in no fixed place. The Roman poet Lucretius, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, is our fullest source for this doctrine. He called the deviation the clinomen, which translates roughly as a slight inclination or swerve. The swerve does two things in the system. First, it explains how atoms combine into complex structures at all. If atoms fall in perfect parallel lines forever, they never collide. Without collision, no compounds form. Without compounds, no rocks, no water, no bodies, no minds. The swerve introduces the initial disruption that makes a universe of complex objects possible. It is not primarily about human freedom, but about the basic conditions for anything to exist. Second, and more controversially, the swerve breaks the chain of deterministic causation. If every event must follow necessarily from prior events, then no creature can initiate a genuinely new sequence of action. But if atoms occasionally deviate without external cause, then the universe contains pockets of indeterminacy. Lucretius connected this directly to the experience of willing something. A horse in a starting gate strains against the barrier, and the moment the gate opens, it surges forward. The surge does not come from an outside push. Something inside the animal initiates the movement, and that internal initiation is only possible in a universe where strict necessity has been broken. The objection is immediate and has never been fully answered. Randomness is not freedom. If an atom swerves without cause, that swerve is random, not chosen. And if your decisions are the result of random atomic deviations rather than determined atomic paths, you have not gained free will. You have traded one form of unfreedom for another. Determinism means your choices are inevitable. Randomness means your choices are arbitrary. Neither one captures what most people mean when they say they choose freely. Epicurus may have had a more subtle position than the bare doctrine suggests. Some scholars argue that he saw the swerve not as the direct cause of each individual decision, but as the condition of possibility for agency itself. In a fully determined universe, no creature can ever initiate anything new. The swerve guarantees that the universe is not fully determined, which opens a space where agency can operate. How agency then operates within that space is a separate question. Epicurus may have held that complex arrangements of atoms, like minds, develop the capacity for self-directed behavior through their very complexity. The swerve creates the opening, but the mind fills it with its own patterns of response and choice. Whether this more sophisticated reading is historically accurate remains debated among scholars. The textual evidence is fragmentary. What is clear is that the swerve was simultaneously one of Epicurus's most creative and most vulnerable moves. It solves a genuine problem: how to preserve moral agency in a materialist universe. It solves it at a genuine cost, introducing uncaused events into a system that otherwise insists everything has a physical explanation. Epicurus was willing to pay that cost because the alternative, a philosophy of self-improvement addressed to beings who cannot actually improve, was incoherent. The swerve remains a gamble, and the bet has not been settled. Part 9. The Garden as Political Philosophy. Epicurus told his students to avoid political life. This was not casual advice, but a direct consequence of the desire classification. Political ambition generates exactly the kinds of desires that the system identifies as toxic. The desire for power, public recognition, influence over others, these are third-category desires with no natural limit. A senator who achieves office immediately wants a higher one. A general who wins a battle immediately calculates the next campaign. Political life is a machine for manufacturing insatiable desires, and insatiable desires are the direct enemy of ataraxia. The advice was also practical. In the political world Epicurus inhabited, involvement in public affairs was genuinely dangerous. Regimes changed rapidly, allies became enemies overnight, and prominence attracted persecution. A philosopher who stayed out of politics was less likely to be exiled, imprisoned, or killed. Withdrawal was not cowardice. It was a rational assessment of risk in an unstable environment. What Epicurus proposed instead was a radically different form of community. The garden was a small group of friends bound together by mutual trust, shared philosophical commitments, and genuine affection. Friendship, not justice, was the central social concept. This is a crucial departure from the entire tradition before him. Plato and Aristotle had treated justice, the proper ordering of relations among people within a political community, as the foundational social virtue. Epicurus replaced it with friendship, which is a voluntary bond between individuals who choose each other. The reasoning connects back to pleasure. Friends provide one of the most reliable sources of katastematic pleasure. They offer conversation, mutual care, and emotional security without the turbulence of political alliances. Friendship has a natural limit. You can only maintain genuine closeness with a small number of people. It does not generate the insatiable dynamics of status competition. A good friend does not make you crave more and better friends the way political success makes you crave more power. Friendship fits the structure of sustainable bounded satisfaction that Epicurus's system demands. There is a real force to this position that modern life confirms daily. The decision to delete a social media account, to leave a high-status career for a quieter life, to stop following political news, is an Epicurean move. It is the deliberate withdrawal from sources of manufactured disturbance in favour of smaller, more controllable pleasures. People who make this choice often describe exactly what Epicurus predicted. Less anxiety, more contentment, a clearer sense of what actually matters to them. But the position has a cost that Epicurus never fully resolved. What happens to the people outside the garden? If the best people withdraw into private communities of philosophical friendship, who governs? Who resists injustice, fights wars of defence, maintains the infrastructure the garden itself depends on? A city full of Epicurean gardens still needs someone to manage the water supply and adjudicate disputes. The retreat into private life is only possible because other people remain in public life. Epicurean withdrawal, pushed to its logical conclusion, is a strategy that works only if not everyone follows it. This is not a minor flaw. It is a structural tension at the heart of Epicurean political thought. Epicurus could respond that most people will never become Epicureans, so the worry is theoretical. But a philosophy that depends on most people not following its advice has a problem of self-consistency. The garden flourishes in the shadow of the city it has rejected. Whether that shadow is a refutation or merely a limitation depends on how much you demand from a philosophy of life. We leave this tension standing because the rival school claimed to have solved it, and that claim is the first thing we need to test. Part 10. Zeno and the Painted Porch. Stoicism was founded by a man whose biography matters for exactly one reason. Zeno of Citium was a merchant who traded in Tyrian purple dye, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient Mediterranean. On a voyage between Phoenicia and the port of Athens, his ship went down and his cargo was destroyed. He lost his fortune in a single event he could neither predict nor prevent. The experience pressed a specific question into him with physical force. What can you rely on when everything external can be taken without warning? Stranded in Athens, Zeno wandered into a bookseller's shop and found a book of dialogues about Socrates. He was struck by the figure of a man who possessed nothing, feared nothing, and claimed that virtue alone constituted a good life. Zeno asked the bookseller where he could find people who lived like Socrates. The bookseller pointed to a passing philosopher named Crates, a member of the Cynic school. The Cynics were radicals who rejected wealth, status, and social convention entirely. They lived on the streets, owned almost nothing, and defined freedom as needing nothing the world could take away. Zeno studied with Crates and absorbed the core Cynic insight. Virtue is the only good, and external things are irrelevant to happiness. But he found the Cynic lifestyle too extreme and their philosophy too narrow. They had the right conclusion about what matters, but they lacked a developed theory explaining why it was right. Over the next 2 decades, Zeno also studied with teachers from the Platonic Academy and the Megarian school. He synthesized these influences into something new. Around 300 before the Common Era, Zeno began teaching in a public colonnade in the Athenian marketplace. This colonnade was called the Stoa Poikile, meaning the painted porch, because its walls were covered in murals of battle scenes. His students became known as Stoics, named after the porch itself. The choice of location was as philosophically significant as Epicurus's choice of a private garden. The porch was public, open, in the centre of civic life. Anyone could stop and listen: merchants, soldiers, enslaved people, visiting foreigners. Where Epicurus withdrew from the city, Zeno planted himself at its heart. This reflects a fundamental difference in orientation that precedes any specific doctrine. Epicurus said the world outside your garden is a source of disturbance to be avoided. Zeno said the world outside your porch is the field in which your character is tested and expressed. The Stoic has obligations to the broader community that the Epicurean does not recognize. This difference in posture toward public life will eventually produce different positions on emotion, on duty, on suffering, and on the structure of the universe itself. But before we reach any of those positions, we need to understand the Stoic cosmos. Just as Epicurean ethics rests on Epicurean physics, Stoic ethics rests on a picture of nature that is the direct opposite of atomism. The universe Epicurus described was dead matter in random motion with no intelligence behind it. The universe the Stoics described was a single living organism with reason running through every part of it. That difference changes everything. Part 11. The Stoic Cosmos, a universe that thinks. The Stoics held that the universe is a single, continuous living being. It is not a collection of separate objects bouncing around in empty space. It is one unified body permeated by a rational force they called logos. Logos means something close to reason, but with a broader scope than the English word suggests. It is the principle of order, pattern, and intelligibility that runs through everything that exists. In Stoic physics, there is no void, no empty space. The universe is a plenum, completely filled with matter. What holds it together and organizes it is a substance the Stoics called pneuma, a mixture of fire and air that penetrates all matter. Pneuma exists at different levels of tension in different things. In rocks and water, it provides basic structural cohesion. In plants, it provides the principle of growth and nutrition. In animals, it provides the capacity for perception and impulse. In human beings, it reaches its highest tension and becomes rational, the capacity to form concepts, make judgments, and direct action through reason. This is not a metaphor. The Stoics were strict materialists, though of a very different kind than Epicurus. Pneuma is a physical substance that physically permeates physical objects. The rationality of the universe is not something added on top of matter, but something matter does at its highest level of organization. When you think a thought, that thought is a physical event, a specific tension pattern in the pneuma of your ruling center, which the Stoics located in the chest. The critical consequence of this physics is that everything that happens in the universe is connected to everything else. Since the universe is one continuous body, no event is isolated. Every cause produces its effects through a web of physical connections that extends throughout the whole. This means the universe is fully determined. Given the state of everything at any moment, the entire future follows necessarily. The Stoics embraced this conclusion openly and called it fate. But here is what makes their determinism different from what most people expect. Because the organizing principle of the universe is rational, the determined sequence of events is not blind or arbitrary. It is providential. Everything that happens is part of a rational plan, even if human beings cannot always see the plan's structure. A drought is not punishment. It is one event in a rationally ordered sequence that produces overall good for the whole, even when it produces local suffering for parts. This is a staggering claim, and it needs to be felt before it is assessed. A mother in ancient Athens buries her child who died of fever. Stoic physics tells her that this event is part of a rational order that is, taken as a whole, the best possible arrangement of the universe. Her child's death is not meaningless. It is a necessary thread in a tapestry that she cannot see completely. Whether this is a source of genuine comfort or an outrageous demand depends entirely on how much weight you give to a universe you cannot fully comprehend. Compare this directly to Epicurean physics. Epicurus says the child's death is atoms dispersing, nothing more. There is no meaning in it, no plan behind it, no cosmic reason it had to happen this way. This is supposed to be liberating. There is no angry God to blame, no failure to atone for, no metaphysical puzzle to solve. The Stoics say the opposite is liberating. There is a reason, and knowing that a rational intelligence governs the whole can reconcile you to even the worst particular outcomes. Two complete inversions of the same reality. Both claim to produce tranquility. The Epicurean achieves peace by removing meaning from suffering. The Stoic achieves peace by insisting that suffering has a meaning you must learn to accept. This is not a minor philosophical difference. It is a choice about the fundamental character of the universe you inhabit, and it determines everything that follows about virtue, emotion, and how you should face what life does to you. Part 12. Why virtue is the only good. Now we can build the central Stoic ethical claim from the ground up. The argument is tight, and each step depends on the one before it. Start with an observation anyone can verify. There are things in your life that you control and things you do not control. You do not control whether a storm destroys your house, whether a disease strikes your body, whether a friend betrays you, or whether the economy collapses. You do not control your own birth, your natural talents, your lifespan, or the political conditions into which you are thrown. Every one of these external circumstances can be altered or removed by forces outside your power. Now, add a premise. If your well-being depends on something that can be taken from you without your consent, then your well-being is permanently hostage to fortune. You might happen to be healthy, wealthy, and surrounded by friends today. Tomorrow, any of these might vanish. If they are genuine components of your good, then their loss makes your life genuinely worse, regardless of anything you do. This was exactly the vulnerability in Aristotle's framework that the historical crisis exposed. The Stoic move is radical. Deny the premise that external things are genuine goods. Health is not a good. Wealth is not a good. Reputation, pleasure, long life, the survival of your children. None of these are goods in the strict sense. The only genuine good is the correct use of your own faculty of judgment. That faculty, and that faculty alone, cannot be taken from you by any external force. A tyrant can imprison your body, but cannot force you to judge incorrectly about what matters. Disease can destroy your health, but cannot destroy your capacity to respond to that destruction with wisdom and courage. This correct use of judgment is what the Stoics mean by virtue. Virtue is not a personality trait or a habit of niceness. It is the consistent, rational, correct assessment of what is genuinely good and bad, combined with action that follows from that assessment. The Stoics defined 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Each is an expression of right reason applied to a specific domain of life. Wisdom is right reason about what to pursue and avoid. Courage is right reason about what to endure. Justice is right reason about what to give others. Temperance is right reason about what to restrain. The conclusion follows with logical force. If virtue is the only genuine good, and virtue is entirely within your control, then your well-being is entirely within your control. No external event can make your life worse in any way that ultimately matters. A Stoic sage, a person who has achieved complete and consistent virtue, is flourishing in a prison cell, on a sickbed, or on a battlefield. The sage's well-being is invulnerable to fortune, which is exactly what the crisis demanded. Now feel the full weight of the immediate objection. A father watches his daughter die of a plague. Stoic doctrine says his daughter's life was not a genuine good. Her death is not a genuine evil. His flourishing, if he judges correctly, is untouched. This seems monstrous. It seems to require that the father feel nothing, care about nothing, treat the death of his child as philosophically insignificant. If Stoicism demands this, most people would reject it, and reasonably so. The Stoics knew this objection was coming, and they had a response. It is subtle enough to require its own treatment. They did not say you should be indifferent to your child's life in the way you are indifferent to a pebble on the road. They introduced a category specifically designed to handle this problem. But whether that category saves the system or quietly undermines it is one of the hardest questions in all of ancient ethics. Part 13. Preferred Indifference. The Stoic Escape Hatch. The problem is stark. Stoics still ate food, sought health, raised families, earned livings, and preferred not to be tortured. If none of these things are genuinely good, why pursue them at all? If health is not a good, why visit a doctor? If your child's life is not a good, why protect your child? The system seems to require either inhuman coldness or flat hypocrisy. The Stoic answer is the doctrine of preferred indifference. It works like this. Things that are not genuinely good or bad occupy a middle category the Stoics called indifferent. Indifferent does not mean worthless. It means irrelevant to your moral status, irrelevant to whether you are virtuous or vicious. Health does not make you a better person. Sickness does not make you a worse one. But within the category of indifference, some things have what the Stoics called selective value. Health, wealth, physical comfort, the survival of your loved ones, these are naturally preferred. Sickness, poverty, pain and loss are naturally dispreferred. A rational being should select the preferred over the dispreferred when circumstances allow. You should eat when food is available. You should protect your children when you can. You should maintain your health when it is in your power to do so. The crucial distinction is in how you hold these things. You pursue preferred indifference as a rational response to your nature as a living organism, not as goods that define your happiness. If circumstances remove them, you do not treat their loss as a catastrophe because they were never the foundation of your well-being. The father whose child dies grieves, but his grief does not destroy him because his deepest good was never located in his child's survival. It was located in his own capacity to love wisely, act justly, and face loss with courage. Think about what this looks like in practice. Two parents receive the same devastating diagnosis about their child. One parent has staked their entire sense of a good life on their child's health and future. When the news arrives, the ground vanishes beneath them. They have no inner resource that is not shattered by this event because everything they valued was concentrated in something they could not control. The other parent loves their child no less, but has organized their inner life differently. Their deepest commitment is to meeting whatever comes with clarity, love, and integrity. The news devastates them, but it does not destroy the core of who they are. They can act, they can care for their child, they can grieve without being annihilated by grief. The Stoics would say the second parent is closer to a good life, not because they feel less, but because their well-being is rooted in something the world cannot take. This is the strongest version of the Stoic position, and it has genuine power. It describes something many people recognize as a real and admirable psychological structure. Therapists today often work toward exactly this, helping people disentangle their core sense of self from outcomes they cannot control. But the critique is also strong. Is the distinction between genuine goods and preferred indifference really stable under pressure? If you say health has selective value and should be pursued when possible, how is that different from saying health is a good? If the loss of a preferred indifferent causes genuine grief, does that not reveal that the person values it as a good, regardless of what the theory says? The Stoic framework may be performing a verbal maneuver, relabeling goods as indifferents, while treating them in practice exactly as goods are treated. The philosophical tradition has debated this for centuries without reaching consensus. There is another layer to the criticism. Aristotle's framework was honest about human vulnerability. It said, yes, bad luck can ruin a good life, and that is a hard truth about being human. The Stoic framework claims to have eliminated that vulnerability. But if preferred indifferents function in daily life exactly the way Aristotle's external goods function, then the Stoics have not eliminated vulnerability. They have renamed it. The question is whether the renaming does genuine psychological and philosophical work, or merely provides the appearance of invulnerability while leaving the substance unchanged. This unresolved tension between what the theory demands and what human experience delivers is the central stress point of Stoic ethics. It does not invalidate the system, but it marks the place where the system is under the most pressure. And it is exactly at this stress point that the Stoic theory of emotion applies the most force. Because for the Stoics, the question of whether you correctly handle the loss of a preferred indifferent is not a test of willpower. It is a test of whether you hold the right beliefs about what is real and what is good. Emotion, for the Stoics, is not a feeling that overwhelms you. It is a judgment you make. And that claim takes us into one of the most radical theories of mind in the ancient world. Part 14. Emotions as Judgments. The Stoic theory of emotion is one of the most radical claims in the history of philosophy. It contradicts what almost everyone believes about their own inner life. The common-sense view goes like this. Emotions are forces that happen to you. Fear grips you. Anger overwhelms you. Grief strikes you. These feelings arise from some part of the mind that is separate from your reasoning, and the best you can do is manage them after they arrive. Plato had formalized this picture by dividing the soul into rational and irrational parts. Aristotle accepted the same basic division. On this view, the task of a good life is to train the irrational parts to obey reason, not to eliminate them. The Stoic philosopher Chrysippus, who led the school in the 3rd century before the Common Era and systematized most of its doctrines, rejected this picture entirely. He argued that the soul is not divided. There is no irrational part that generates emotions independently of your reasoning. The ruling center of the soul, what the Stoics called the hegemonikon, is a single, unified, rational faculty. Every emotion you experience is a judgment made by that faculty, not accompanied by a judgment, not triggered by a judgment. The emotion literally is the judgment itself. Here is what that means concretely. You are walking home at night and hear footsteps behind you. Your heart rate increases, your muscles tense, your breathing shallows. The common sense explanation: fear has been triggered in your body by the stimulus. The Stoic explanation: you have judged that a bad thing is about to happen and that it is beyond your control. That judgment is not separate from the fear. It is the fear. The physical symptoms are the bodily expression of a rational act, a judgment about value that you have already performed. This has a direct and dramatic practical consequence. If fear is a judgment, then fear can be wrong. Not wrong in the sense that your body overreacted, but wrong in the sense that you assessed the situation incorrectly. Maybe the footsteps belong to a neighbor. Maybe, even if they belong to a threat, your safety is not a genuine good in the Stoic sense, so its loss is not a genuine evil. If the judgment is corrected, the emotion does not just diminish. It disappears, because there is nothing left to sustain it. The emotion was the judgment, and the judgment has been withdrawn. The Stoics categorized the destructive emotions into four main types. Distress is the judgment that something bad is currently present. Fear is the judgment that something bad is approaching. Appetite or craving is the judgment that something good is approaching that you must have. And a kind of irrational elation is the judgment that something genuinely good is currently present when it is not. All four rest on the same error, treating an indifferent thing as if it were a genuine good or evil. But the Stoics did not claim that the wise person is emotionless. This is a critical distinction that most popular accounts of Stoicism miss. The sage still experiences what the Stoics called eupatheia, meaning good feelings or correct emotional responses. Joy replaces irrational elation. It is the rational recognition that something genuinely good, namely virtue, is present. Wish replaces appetite. It is the rational desire for what is truly worth pursuing. Caution replaces fear. It is the rational awareness of genuine dangers to one's moral character. The sage is not a stone. The sage feels deeply, but every feeling tracks a correct judgment about what is real. Chrysippus used a vivid comparison to explain why emotions are hard to dislodge even when you recognize them as false. He compared someone in the grip of passion to a runner sprinting too fast to stop. The runner has committed to the sprint, and even if he recognizes he should slow down, his momentum carries him forward. The passion has been set in motion by a judgment already made, and the pneuma in the soul has been agitated into a pattern that resists immediate correction. This is why Stoic therapy is not a one-time insight, but a daily practice of attention. You must catch the judgment before it generates momentum, in the gap between the impression and your assent to it. This theory is more sophisticated than it first sounds, but it faces a specific challenge from modern science. Research in affective neuroscience has identified emotional responses that appear to bypass conscious judgment entirely. The amygdala can trigger a fear response before the cortex has finished processing what the stimulus is. A person with certain kinds of brain damage can experience emotional arousal without any corresponding cognitive content. These findings suggest that at least some emotions are not judgments, but precognitive reactions that judgment can modify but did not create. Whether this refutes the Stoic theory or merely requires its refinement is a question the ancient Stoics could not have anticipated. But it marks a genuine boundary of the model, and the rival school had a different picture of the same territory. Part 15. Epicurean Emotions, a different map. The Epicurean approach to emotion starts from the same observation the Stoics use, but draws the opposite conclusion. Both schools agree that false beliefs cause destructive emotions. A person who falsely believes the gods are punishing her will experience unnecessary terror. A person who falsely believes death is a transition to suffering will live in constant dread. Strip away the false belief, and the terror dissolves. On this much, the two schools are identical. The disagreement is about what happens once false beliefs are removed. The Stoics say that all destructive emotions are false judgments, without exception. Grief at a friend's death, if it disrupts your tranquility, rests on the false judgment that your friend's survival was a genuine good. The Epicureans say this goes too far. Some emotions are natural responses to genuine features of your situation, and suppressing them would mean suppressing something your biology is correctly telling you. Epicurus divided emotions the same way he divided desires. Some emotional responses are natural and track real needs. The pain of losing a close friend is natural, because friendship is one of the genuine goods that contribute to ataraxia. That pain is not an error to be corrected by better judgment. It is the appropriate response of an organism that has lost something genuinely valuable. The task is not to eliminate the grief, but to prevent it from spiraling into something it does not need to be. Other emotional responses are generated by false beliefs and cultural conditioning. The anxiety of a businessman who fears losing his reputation, the envy of a neighbour who has acquired a larger house, the dread of someone who believes the gods will punish him after death. These are the emotional equivalents of third-category desires, not rooted in nature, not tracking anything real, and therefore removable through philosophical understanding. The practical difference is sharpest in the case of grief. A Stoic who has fully internalized the doctrine of indifference should, in principle, not be devastated by the death of a loved one. The loved one's life was a preferred indifferent, not a genuine good. Grief that overwhelms is a sign that the judgment has not been properly corrected. An Epicurean can grieve without philosophical failure. The friend was genuinely good for your life, and the loss is genuinely bad within the framework of natural pleasure and pain. What the Epicurean should not do is magnify the grief with false beliefs, that the friend is suffering in an afterlife, that the loss means life itself is pointless, that some cosmic injustice has been committed. Strip those additions away, and what remains is clean, natural sorrow that will subside on its own. This difference is not academic. It determines what each school tells you to do when you are suffering. The Stoic tells you to examine your judgment and find the error in it. The Epicurean tells you to separate the natural signal from the cultural noise and stop amplifying the noise. One approach treats your emotion as fundamentally mistaken. The other treats it as partly right and partly contaminated. Which model better maps? The actual experience of suffering is a question neither school settled definitively. It is also a question that contemporary psychology continues to negotiate between cognitive and emotion-focused approaches to therapy. Part 16. The Stoic Practice, Living the Theory. Stoic philosophy was never meant to be a set of beliefs held in the mind and left there. It was a discipline practiced daily with specific exercises, each one derived from a specific piece of theory. The most fundamental practice was the discipline of assent. Every moment of waking life, impressions arrive in your mind, perceptions, thoughts, reactions. The Stoic training is to insert a pause between the impression and your agreement with it. An impression arrives. This traffic delay is ruining my day. The discipline of assent says, stop, the traffic delay is a fact. The claim that it is ruining your day is a judgment you have not yet examined. do not assent to it automatically. Examine whether what you are calling bad actually threatens anything that qualifies as a genuine good. If it does not, withdraw assent, and the emotional charge collapses. Epictetus, who was born into slavery in the 1st century of the Common Era and later became one of the most influential Stoic teachers, gave his students a direct instruction for this practice. When a disturbing impression strikes, address it directly. You are only an appearance, and not at all the thing you appear to be. This is not positive thinking or denial. It is a trained refusal to let an unexamined impression become a settled conviction. The second major practice was the premeditation of adversity. Each morning, the Stoic mentally rehearses the worst things that might happen during the day. Not to generate anxiety, but to remove its power in advance. If you have already contemplated the possibility that your project will fail, that a friend will betray you, that your body will suffer pain, then when these things occur, they do not arrive as shocks. You have already practiced the correct judgment. These are indifferent events that do not touch your virtue. The rehearsal transforms surprise into recognition. The third practice was the evening review. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 of the Common Era, wrote his private philosophical notebooks as exactly this kind of exercise. Each evening he examined the day's events and his responses to them. Where did he assent to a false impression? Where did he treat an indifferent as a genuine good? Where did he fail to act with courage, justice, or temperance? The purpose was not guilt, but calibration, adjusting the instrument of judgment so that tomorrow's responses are more accurate than today's. These three practices, the discipline of assent, the premeditation of adversity, and the evening review, form the core of Stoic daily training. Each one is a direct application of theory to the texture of ordinary life. The discipline of assent applies the theory that emotions are judgments. The premeditation applies the doctrine of preferred indifference. The evening review applies the Stoic commitment to moral progress as a lifelong project. What is striking is how precisely these practices reappeared in the 20th century. When Aaron Beck developed cognitive therapy for depression in the 1960s, and when Albert Ellis developed rational emotive behavior therapy a decade earlier, both men explicitly cited Epictetus as an intellectual ancestor. The core principle of cognitive behavioral therapy is that emotional disturbance comes from interpretations of events, not from the events themselves. This is the Stoic theory of passions, restated in clinical language. The therapeutic technique of identifying automatic thoughts and questioning their accuracy is the discipline of assent with a new name. The homework assignments that CBT therapists give, asking patients to track triggering events, record their emotional responses, and examine the beliefs that mediate between the two, closely parallel the Stoic evening review. This is not a loose thematic parallel. Beck and his colleagues stated in their foundational treatment manual that the philosophical origins of cognitive therapy trace directly to the Stoic philosophers. Ellis went further and claimed that he personally rescued Epictetus from near obscurity by reviving his ideas in a clinical context. The lineage is documented and acknowledged by the founders of the modern tradition. But the connection also reveals a limit. CBT works well for many conditions, but its effectiveness is uneven, and some of its critics argue that it overemphasizes cognitive factors at the expense of bodily and relational ones. The same critique applies to Stoic psychology. If some emotions bypass cognition entirely, as the neuroscience of fear conditioning suggests, then a purely judgment-based therapy has a structural blind spot. The Stoics built the most powerful cognitive toolkit the ancient world produced. Whether cognition is the whole story of emotional life is the question their toolkit cannot answer from within. Part 17. The Epicurean Practice. Living the Theory. Epicurean practice is less well known than Stoic practice, partly because fewer Epicurean texts survived, and partly because the exercises are quieter and less dramatic. But the system had its own rigorous daily discipline, and it was designed with the same precision. The first practice was memorization and repetition of core doctrines. Epicurus expected his students to commit the principal teachings to memory and recite them regularly. This was not rote learning for its own sake. The tetrapharmakos and the principal doctrines were mental medicines to be administered in moments of distress. When you wake at 3 a.m, gripped by the fear of death, the remedy is not a fresh philosophical argument. It is the immediate availability of an argument you have already internalized so deeply that it can meet the fear at its own speed. Memorization made the philosophy available as a reflex rather than a conclusion you had to rederive each time. The second practice was the deliberate recall of past pleasures. Epicurus taught that memory is itself a source of katastematic pleasure. When your present circumstances are difficult, you can stabilize your mind by recollecting good conversations, meals shared with friends, moments of intellectual delight. This is not escapism. It is a technique for demonstrating to yourself that pleasure is not confined to the present moment. Your store of good experiences is a resource that no external event can confiscate. Epicurus reportedly used this technique himself during his final illness, sustaining contentment through memories of friendship while enduring severe kidney stones. The third practice was the deliberate simplification of daily life. Eating plain food, not as punishment, but as training. If you regularly eat simple meals and find them satisfying, you have demonstrated to yourself that your happiness does not depend on luxury. The next time luxury is unavailable, you are not deprived. You have already verified that the simpler version meets your actual needs. This is not asceticism for spiritual credit. It is empirical testing of the desire classification. You are running the experiment on your own nervous system to confirm that third-category desires are genuinely unnecessary. The fourth practice was the cultivation of gratitude, not as a moral duty, but as a philosophical discipline. The person who notices and appreciates what is already present, the warmth of sunlight, the presence of a friend, the absence of pain, is training attention toward katastematic pleasure. The person who habitually scans for what is missing is training attention toward unsatisfied desire. Gratitude, for the Epicurean, is a perceptual skill that shifts your default mode from deficit to sufficiency. These practices are less structured than the Stoic equivalents, and the historical record preserves less detail about how they were taught and sequenced. Part of the reason is that Epicureanism was more successfully suppressed by later institutions than Stoicism was. The writings of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius survived because Christianity could absorb key Stoic ideas. Epicurean writings were actively destroyed or neglected because their content was threatening to the institutions that curated the archive. The asymmetry in how much we know about each school's practice is not a reflection of which school was more rigorous. It is a reflection of which school's enemies controlled the libraries. Part 18. Death, the ultimate test case. Both schools claimed to have solved the problem of fearing death. Their solutions are structurally opposite, and the gap between them reveals everything about the deeper disagreement. The Epicurean solution, as we have seen, works by subtraction. Death is the end of experience. When your atoms disperse, the subject who might have feared death no longer exists. There is nothing to fear because there will be no one to experience anything. The argument strips death of metaphysical content and leaves it as a bare physical event, no different in kind from a rock eroding or a fire going out. The Stoic solution works by addition. Death is not the end of a meaningless process, but a necessary event within a rational cosmic order. Your death is part of the Logos, woven into the structure of a universe that is, taken as a whole, the best possible arrangement. Resisting death is resisting nature, and resisting nature is the definition of irrationality in Stoic ethics. The correct response to death is not indifference, but active acceptance. This was always going to happen. It is part of a rational order, and my task is to meet it with the same virtue I brought to every other circumstance. Now press each solution where it is weakest. The Epicurean argument tells you that death is nothing to you because you will not be there to experience it. A woman with terminal cancer, 53 years old, with children she will not see graduate, is told that her death is not a loss because she will not exist to register the absence. She may well respond, "The loss is real, precisely because I will not be there." It is not the experience of being dead that frightens her, but the extinction of all future experience. The Epicurean symmetry argument says she should feel the same way about the time before her birth. But there is an obvious asymmetry. Before her birth, there were no projects, relationships, or hopes that her non-existence interrupted. After her death, there are. Whether this asymmetry is philosophically decisive or merely psychologically powerful is genuinely contested. The Stoic argument tells her that her death is part of a rational plan, a plan she cannot see in full but can trust because the universe is governed by Logos. She may well respond, "What rational plan requires my children to grow up without a mother?" The Stoic can say that the plan operates at the level of the whole, and what looks unjust at the level of the part may be necessary for the good of the whole. But this response asks the dying woman to subordinate her specific, concrete loss to an abstract totality she can never verify. It demands trust in a cosmic rationality that her suffering seems to contradict. Neither solution is obviously wrong, and neither is obviously sufficient. The Epicurean approach has the advantage of not requiring you to believe anything about the universe's intentions. It asks only that you accept a materialist account of what death is. Its disadvantage is that it offers no meaning, no framework in which your death serves any purpose beyond the dispersal of atoms. The Stoic approach has the advantage of embedding your death in a larger story that gives it significance. Its disadvantage is that the story requires a metaphysical commitment, the belief in a providential cosmos that many people cannot make honestly. What both approaches share is a commitment to the idea that philosophical preparation can change the experience of dying. Whether you arrive at your death believing it is nothing or believing it is necessary, the preparation aims to ensure that you are not destroyed by terror, regret, or despair. Both schools would say that the untrained mind dies badly, not because death itself is bad, but because the beliefs the untrained mind brings to death generate unnecessary suffering. The disagreement is about which beliefs you should bring instead. And that disagreement has never been closed. Part 19. The Problem of Other People's Suffering. We have been examining what each philosophy says about your own life, your own desires, your own death. The harder test is what they say about suffering that belongs to someone else. A Stoic walks through a market and sees a child begging, visibly malnourished. Stoic doctrine says that the child's hunger is the loss of a preferred indifferent, not a genuine evil. The child's potential death is not a genuine evil either. So, on what grounds does the Stoic stop and help? The answer comes from two connected doctrines. First, the Stoics held that all rational beings share in the same logos, the same universal reason. This makes every human being a member of a single rational community, regardless of nationality, status, or proximity. The Stoics called this cosmopolitanism, the idea that your obligations extend to all of humanity, not just your family or your city. Second, the Stoics developed a theory of appropriate actions, things a rational being should do in accordance with their nature and social role. Feeding a hungry child is an appropriate action for any rational being who encounters one. You do it not because the child's hunger is a genuine evil, but because acting with justice and compassion is an expression of your virtue. The reason for helping is located in the helper's moral character, not in the child's external condition. This is a workable answer, but it has a specific vulnerability. If the child's suffering is genuinely indifferent, then the urgency to act comes entirely from the agent's need to express virtue. The child is, in a sense, an occasion for your moral development rather than a being whose suffering demands response on its own terms. A critic might say that real compassion requires recognizing the other person's pain as a genuine evil, not just as an opportunity for you to practice justice. If you help the child primarily because helping is virtuous, rather than because the child is suffering and suffering is bad, there is something missing from your moral response. Something that most people would call empathy. Now put the same child in front of an Epicurean. The Epicurean has retreated to a garden designed to minimize disturbance and maximize tranquility among friends. The child in the market is outside the garden, outside the community of mutual trust. Epicurean philosophy generates no strong concept of obligation to strangers. Friendship, not justice, is the central social bond, and friendship is voluntary, selective, and limited in scope. The Epicurean might help the child out of natural compassion, which Epicurus acknowledged as a real human impulse. but the philosophy provides no systematic reason why the Epicurean must help. There is no cosmopolitan duty, no doctrine of universal rational community, no theory of appropriate action toward all humans. The Epicurean's primary obligation is to protect his own ataraxia and that of his friends. Engaging with the suffering of strangers, if it disturbs your tranquility, might actually be contrary to the system's recommendations. Both positions face a version of the same problem from opposite directions. The Stoic has the conceptual resources for universal obligation, but struggles to ground that obligation in genuine recognition of suffering as bad. The Epicurean has the emotional resources for compassion, but lacks the conceptual framework for extending it beyond the garden walls. Neither school provides a fully satisfying account of what you owe to people whose suffering you did not choose to encounter. This gap is not a minor deficiency. It is the place where both philosophies meet the limits of their own starting assumptions. Part 20. Stoicism in Rome, Power and Paradox. Stoicism migrated from Athens to Rome and became the de facto philosophy of the Roman governing class. This migration produced three figures whose lives test the philosophy under conditions its founders never anticipated. Seneca was born around 4 years before the Common Era in Roman Spain and became one of the wealthiest men in the empire. He served as tutor and advisor to the Emperor Nero, one of the most erratic rulers in Roman history. Seneca wrote extensively about the sufficiency of virtue, the irrelevance of wealth, and the importance of philosophical detachment from fortune. Meanwhile, his personal fortune was enormous, accumulated partly through political connections and aggressive lending practices. His contemporaries noticed the contradiction and mocked him for it. The tension in Seneca's case is not simple hypocrisy. Within Stoic doctrine, wealth is a preferred indifferent. You may possess it without treating it as a genuine good, just as you may eat food without considering food the point of your life. Seneca argued that the wise person does not love wealth, but accepts it, using it as a field for the exercise of virtue. Generosity requires resources. Influence can be used to promote justice. The question is whether Seneca actually held his wealth with the detachment he prescribed, or whether the prescription was an elaborate justification for a life he could not bring himself to change. His own writings suggest he was genuinely uncertain, treating the tension as an ongoing philosophical problem rather than a resolved one. Epictetus presents the opposite case. Born into slavery, he spent his early life as the property of a secretary to Nero. After gaining his freedom, he became a teacher and eventually ran a school of Stoic philosophy until the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome. Epictetus taught the same doctrine as Seneca, that virtue is the only good and externals are indifferent, but from a position of having actually lost everything external. When Epictetus says that a slave and a senator are equally capable of the good life, the claim carries a weight it cannot carry in Seneca's mouth. He had lived the claim's most extreme test case. Marcus Aurelius represents a third configuration. He was Emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 of the Common Era, commanding the largest military force on earth while privately writing notebooks reminding himself that fame is smoke, the body is a sack of blood and bones, and nothing external has value. His reign was plagued by wars, plague and rebellion. He spent much of it in military camps on the northern frontier, far from Rome, trying to govern justly while believing that justice itself was the only thing that mattered, and that the outcomes of his governance were, strictly speaking, indifferent. The three cases form a pattern that is not about hypocrisy, but about a genuine philosophical question. Does Stoicism work differently depending on how much power you hold? For Epictetus, the doctrine of indifference to externals is straightforwardly liberating. When you have nothing, being told that nothing external matters is an act of emancipation. For Seneca, the same doctrine becomes ambiguous. When you have everything, being told that none of it matters can look like a convenient excuse to keep it. For Marcus Aurelius, the doctrine creates an almost unbearable tension. You are responsible for the fate of millions, and your philosophy tells you that their fates are not genuine goods or evils. You must govern as if outcomes matter while believing, at your philosophical core, that they do not. This is not a flaw unique to Stoicism. It is a problem faced by any philosophy that separates inner virtue from external conditions. But Stoicism's three most famous practitioners embody it with unusual clarity. The slave, the senator, and the emperor all holding the same doctrine, each one testing it against a radically different relationship to power. The doctrine survives all three tests, but it survives differently in each case. And that differential survival raises the question of whether a philosophy that bends this much under pressure is truly one philosophy or three. Part 21, Epicureanism's Disappearance and Stoicism's Survival. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, both schools were thriving across the Roman world. By the 5th century, Stoicism had been absorbed into Christianity, while Epicureanism had been nearly destroyed. The reasons for this asymmetry are not philosophical, but institutional, and they reveal something important about both systems. Stoicism had several features that Christianity could adopt with minimal modification. The Stoic cosmos was governed by a rational, providential intelligence. Replace logos with God, and the structure is preserved. The Stoic emphasis on duty, self-discipline, and moral seriousness translated directly into Christian asceticism and moral theology. The Stoic doctrine of universal human community mapped onto the Christian idea of the brotherhood of all believers. Even the Stoic theory of natural law, the idea that rational principles govern the universe and can be discovered by reason, became a foundational element of Christian legal and moral philosophy. Epicureanism had almost nothing Christianity could use, and almost everything Christianity needed to suppress. Epicurus denied the immortality of the soul. He denied divine providence. He denied that the gods care about human affairs. He made pleasure the highest good and recommended withdrawal from civic and religious obligation. Every one of these positions was directly opposed to core Christian commitments. An Epicurean world is a world with no afterlife, no judgment, no cosmic meaning, and no reason to obey religious authority. For an institution building power on precisely those foundations, Epicureanism was not merely wrong, but dangerous. The suppression was effective. Epicurus's major works were lost. His 37-book treatise on nature survived only in charred fragments from a villa buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era. The full texts of his letters, his systematic philosophy, his detailed arguments were either destroyed or simply not copied by the monastic scribes who preserved the rest of the ancient library. What survived were a few short letters preserved by the biographer Diogenes Laertius, a set of brief doctrinal summaries, and the 6-book Latin poem by Lucretius, which itself was lost for 1,000 years before being rediscovered in a German monastery in 1417. The near erasure of Epicureanism from the Western tradition was not an accident of neglect. It was the result of a specific judgment by the institutions that controlled textual transmission. Christian writers from Lactantius to Augustine treated Epicurus as a symbol of godless hedonism, a caricature that bore little resemblance to the actual philosophy but served the purpose of discrediting it. The word Epicurean itself became a slur, meaning self-indulgent and irreligious, which is how it entered modern European languages. This matters for understanding the present. The fact that Stoicism is widely known and Epicureanism is widely misunderstood is not evidence that one is superior to the other. It is evidence that one was compatible with the institutions that shaped Western civilization and the other was threatening to them. The recovery of Epicurean philosophy as a serious intellectual tradition is a modern project, still underway, still encountering the residual effects of centuries of deliberate distortion. Any fair comparison of the two schools must account for this asymmetry before concluding that the better-known school is the better philosophy. Part 22. The Hedonic Treadmill and the Epicurean Prediction. In 1971, psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell published a paper describing a phenomenon they called the hedonic treadmill. The core finding was that human beings tend to return to a baseline level of happiness after both positive and negative life events. In 1978, Brickman and colleagues tested this by studying lottery winners and people who had become paralyzed in accidents. The results were striking. Lottery winners were not significantly happier than a control group, and accident victims, while initially devastated, reported happiness levels closer to the baseline than anyone expected. The implication is that the pursuit of positive external change, more money, a better job, a bigger house, produces diminishing returns on happiness. The initial burst of satisfaction fades as the new circumstances become the new normal. You adapt to the improvement and begin scanning for the next one. The treadmill keeps moving, and you stay in roughly the same place. This is almost exactly what Epicurus predicted 23 centuries earlier. His distinction between kinetic and catastematic pleasure maps directly onto the treadmill phenomenon. Kinetic pleasure, the active sensation of satisfying a desire, fades as the satisfaction becomes routine. You win the lottery, the thrill subsides, and you are back where you started emotionally. Catastematic pleasure, the stable state of having no unmet need, is the only kind that does not fade, because it is not a response to a change in circumstances. It is a baseline condition of sufficiency. Epicurus's desire classification also predicts the treadmill's mechanism. Third category desires, the ones that are neither natural nor necessary, have no natural stopping point. Modern research on income and happiness confirms this with some precision. Studies have found that beyond a threshold sufficient to cover basic needs and security, additional income produces progressively smaller increases in reported well-being. The person earning twice the threshold is not twice as happy. Epicurus would say this is because the additional income is satisfying desires that were not natural in the first place. But the modern data also complicates the Epicurean picture. Brickman's original finding has been revised by subsequent research. Dina, Lucas and Scollon showed in 2006 that people do not all return to the same neutral set point. Individual set points vary. They are partly heritable, and some events, particularly severe disability and prolonged unemployment, can cause lasting decreases in well-being. Adaptation is real, but not total. Some losses are not absorbed by the psychological immune system. This means Epicurus was partly right and partly wrong. He was right that the pursuit of kinetic pleasure through external improvement is a losing strategy. The data confirms that most positive external changes are adapted to relatively quickly. He was right that the desires most resistant to satisfaction are the socially constructed ones: status, comparative wealth, fame. He may have been wrong about the scope of ataraxia's achievability. If baseline happiness is partly heritable, then philosophical training alone may not be sufficient to reach the state of undisturbed contentment he promised. Some people may be constitutionally closer to ataraxia than others, regardless of their philosophical development. This does not refute Epicureanism, but it imposes a biological limit on its ambitions. Part 23. Cognitive Behavioral Therapy and the Stoic Blueprint. The connection between Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy is not a loose analogy. It is a documented intellectual debt, acknowledged by the founders of both major branches of cognitive therapy. Albert Ellis developed rational emotive behavior therapy in the 1950s as the first explicitly cognitive approach to psychotherapy. He was trained in psychoanalysis but found it ineffective and theoretically unsatisfying. He turned instead to the Stoic philosophers, particularly Epictetus, and built his entire therapeutic model on a principle he traced directly to the ancient school. The principle: people are not disturbed by events, but by their beliefs about events. Ellis called this the ABC model. An activating event occurs, a belief mediates between the event and the response, and a consequence, the emotional and behavioral outcome, follows from the belief, not from the event. Change the belief, and the consequence changes. Aaron Beck developed cognitive therapy independently in the 1960s, working primarily with depressed patients. He noticed that his patients experienced streams of automatic negative thoughts that they treated as facts. A patient would think, "I am worthless," in response to a minor setback, and experience the thought not as an interpretation, but as a direct perception of reality. Beck's therapeutic method was to teach patients to identify these automatic thoughts, examine the evidence for and against them, and replace distorted thoughts with more accurate ones. In the foundational treatment manual he co-authored in 1979, Beck stated explicitly that the philosophical origins of cognitive therapy can be traced to the Stoic philosophers. The overlap is specific, not general. The Stoic discipline of assent, pausing between an impression and your agreement with it, corresponds to the CBT technique of catching automatic thoughts before they become settled beliefs. The Stoic practice of examining whether an event truly threatens a genuine good corresponds to the CBT technique of cognitive restructuring, testing whether a belief is supported by evidence. The Stoic evening review corresponds to the CBT homework of tracking thoughts, emotions and behaviours across the day. Epicurus's instruction to address a disturbing impression directly, telling it that it is only an appearance and not the thing it claims to be, corresponds to what later cognitive therapists called cognitive distancing or diffusion. But CBT also departs from Stoicism in ways that illuminate the ancient model's limits. Stoicism claims that all destructive emotions rest on false judgments about value. CBT makes a weaker and more empirical claim that many cases of depression and anxiety involve identifiable cognitive distortions that can be corrected. CBT does not commit to the Stoic position that a person with perfectly accurate beliefs would experience no destructive emotion. It leaves room for emotions that have biological or neurochemical components not fully captured by the cognitive model. Third-wave cognitive therapies, developed from the 1980s onward, push the departure further. Approaches like acceptance and commitment therapy borrow more from Buddhist mindfulness than from Stoic judgment correction. They suggest that some distressing thoughts should not be challenged or restructured, but simply observed and allowed to pass. This is closer to an Epicurean attitude. The thought is there. It is a natural part of the mind's weather, and your task is not to fix it, but to stop amplifying it. The evolution of cognitive therapy from first wave to third wave roughly recapitulates the ancient debate between Stoic and Epicurean approaches to emotion. The therapeutic tradition confirms that the Stoic insight is powerful and practically effective. Changing how you think about events genuinely changes how you feel about them, and this can be demonstrated in clinical trials. What the tradition also confirms is that the insight has boundaries. Not all suffering is cognitive in origin, and not all cognitive interventions reach the root. The Stoics built the strongest possible version of the cognitive case. Modern psychology has validated much of it while also identifying the terrain it does not cover. Part 24. Where each philosophy breaks. Stoicism. The strongest objections to Stoicism are not the easy ones. The easy objection that Stoics are cold and unfeeling is based on a misunderstanding the Stoics explicitly addressed. The hard objections go deeper, and they do not have clean answers. The first hard objection is the problem of radical loss. A mother watches her child die slowly of an illness. Stoic doctrine says her child's life was a preferred indifferent, that the correct response is grief modulated by the understanding that nothing genuinely good has been lost, and that her flourishing remains intact if her virtue remains intact. The mother may accept this framework in theory. In the actual moment of her child's death, can the distinction between a genuine good and a preferred indifferent bear the weight placed on it? Or does the experience of catastrophic loss reveal that the distinction was always thinner than the theory required? If the mother's grief is total and her world is shattered, the Stoic must say she has judged incorrectly. Many thoughtful people would say instead that she has judged correctly and that the Stoic system has misdescribed the terrain. The second hard objection is the problem of systemic injustice. If your well-being depends only on your own virtue and no external condition can make your life worse in a way that ultimately matters, then Stoicism can become an ideology of endurance that serves the powerful. A slaveholder can tell the enslaved person that their chains are indifferent and that true freedom is internal. This is, in fact, roughly what some Roman Stoics said, and the history of the idea's reception includes exactly this use. The question is whether Stoicism has the resources to resist this co-optation, or whether its framework structurally enables it. If external conditions are genuinely irrelevant to well-being, then there is less philosophical urgency to change them. The Stoic concept of cosmopolitan duty provides a counterweight, but the counterweight may not be strong enough when the doctrine of indifference to externals is taken at full force. The third hard objection is the problem of determinism and responsibility. The Stoic cosmos is fully determined by the rational chain of fate. Every action you take, including every virtuous or vicious action, is part of the predetermined causal order. On what grounds do you praise virtue or blame vice, if both were inevitable? The Stoics had a response. You praise virtue because praising virtue is itself part of the causal order that produces more virtue. Blame functions similarly. But this turns moral evaluation into a mechanical process, a cog in the deterministic machine, rather than a genuine assessment of someone who could have done otherwise. If the vicious person could not have chosen virtue, in what sense are they responsible for their vice? Each of these objections has a Stoic reply. The reply to the first is that the mother's grief is natural, but should not be confused with the correct assessment of value. The reply to the second is that cosmopolitan duty provides ample reason to fight injustice even if external conditions are indifferent to the agent's own well-being. The reply to the third is that determinism is compatible with moral agency, because the agent's character is part of the causal chain that determines outcomes. Each reply is intelligent, none is fully decisive. The objections remain standing not as refutations, but as permanent pressure points that the system cannot fully absorb. Part 25. Where each philosophy breaks. Epicureanism. Epicureanism faces objections of equal force, targeting different vulnerabilities. The first hard objection is the problem of withdrawal and complicity. If your philosophy tells you to retreat from public life and cultivate private tranquility, what happens when the world outside your garden is engulfed in injustice? An Epicurean living comfortably in Athens, while the Macedonian generals enslave populations across the eastern Mediterranean, is, on his own philosophy's advice, doing the right thing by staying out of it. But doing the right thing, in this case, looks indistinguishable from doing nothing while others suffer. The Epicurean might respond that political engagement would not actually help and would certainly damage his own tranquility. But this response concedes that the philosophy has no resources for addressing collective suffering that private withdrawal cannot touch. The second hard objection is the problem of the swerve. The entire Epicurean ethical program depends on your ability to choose which desires to cultivate and which to abandon. Choice requires free will. Free will in a materialist universe requires the swerve. But the swerve introduces uncaused randomness into the atomic level of reality. Even on the most generous reading, it is unclear how randomness at the level of atoms produces genuine agency at the level of persons. If the swerve is the best foundation Epicureanism can provide for moral responsibility, the foundation is unstable. The entire Tower of Desire classification, philosophical therapy, and the good life rests on a gamble about physics that was contested in antiquity, and has not become less contested since. The third hard objection is the problem of scope. Epicureanism is a philosophy of individual and small group flourishing. It does not address, and arguably cannot address, structural violence, collective injustice, or obligations to future generations. A philosophy that tells you to simplify your desires and enjoy your friends is powerful advice for personal well-being. It has almost nothing to say about climate change, systemic poverty, or the design of just institutions. These are problems that require collective action, political engagement, and long-term planning, precisely the activities Epicurus told you to avoid. You might say that Epicureanism was never meant to be a political philosophy. Fair enough. But a philosophy of life that cannot address the conditions under which millions of people live and die has a gap at its centre that no amount of personal tranquility can fill. The fourth hard objection, less often raised but genuinely cutting, is the problem of moral motivation. If pleasure is the sole good, even pleasure defined as the absence of pain, then your reason for helping others is always ultimately self-referential. You help a friend because friendship provides you with catastematic pleasure. You are generous because generosity makes your life more tranquil. There is no room in the system for genuine altruism, for helping someone at a real cost to yourself because their suffering matters independently of its effect on your peace of mind. Epicurus might respond that this is simply what all motivation is, and that pretending otherwise is self-deception. But many people experience moral motivation as genuinely other-directed, and a philosophy that cannot account for this experience is describing a smaller portion of human moral life than it claims to cover. As with Stoicism, each objection has a reply, and each reply is incomplete. The objections do not destroy Epicureanism, but they mark the places where the system cannot generate answers from its own resources. Both philosophies reach their limits at roughly the same frontier, the point where individual inner life meets collective external conditions that individual philosophy cannot reshape alone. Part 26. The choice you are already making. We began with a question that arose in Athens 23 centuries ago. How do you live well when the world offers no guarantees? The question has not been answered. It has been structured. Epicurus structured the answer around subtraction. Remove false beliefs, eliminate unnecessary desires, reduce your exposure to sources of disturbance, and what remains is a life of quiet sufficiency. The cost of this answer is disengagement. You gain tranquility at the price of the scope of your concerns. The world beyond your garden is not your problem, and the suffering within it, unless it reaches your door, is not your responsibility. The Stoics structured the answer around redefinition. Redefine what counts as good until nothing external qualifies. Locate your entire well-being in the one thing that cannot be taken, your own rational judgment. The cost of this answer is severity. You gain invulnerability at the price of acknowledging that the things most people care about most, health, family, security, are not genuinely good. Neither school asks you to do something you are not already doing in fragmentary, unreflective ways. Every time you turn off the news to protect your mental state, you are making an Epicurean move. Every time you tell yourself that a setback does not define you, you are making a Stoic move. Every time you ask whether your anxiety is tracking a real problem or manufacturing a false one, you are rehearsing the central question both schools tried to answer. Every time you weigh whether to engage with a political crisis or protect your peace, you are reenacting the debate between the porch and the garden. The debate is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent structural feature of human life. As long as people are vulnerable to fortune, they will be pulled between the Epicurean impulse to minimize exposure and the Stoic impulse to redefine what fortune can touch. As long as people suffer emotions they did not choose, they will be pulled between the Stoic claim that emotion is judgment and the Epicurean claim that some emotions are natural signals worth preserving. As long as societies generate injustice, people will be pulled between the obligation to engage and the recognition that engagement can destroy your peace. What the listener gains from this is not a winner, it is precision. You now know exactly what each commitment demands. Epicureanism demands that you accept a smaller life in exchange for greater control over your inner state. Stoicism demands that you accept a harsher metaphysics in exchange for greater range of engagement with the world. Both demand rigorous philosophical training, not as an academic exercise, but as the daily practice of a skill on which your well-being depends. Both pay real costs for their real benefits. The question from 23 centuries ago is still open. It is open in you right now, in the decisions you will make this week about what to care about, what to let go of, and how to hold the things you cannot control. You are not choosing between two dead schools of thought. You are choosing between two live orientations toward a problem that will not go away. The choice has always been yours. Now you know what you are choosing between